closest to this church because not many of you walked here. So we live right behind the church. You go down the hill and you hit our house. So, okay, there was one time we did not, but we're not going to get into that, Adrian. Yes. Well, actually, 4 years ago, we stood up here, but it was quite a different scenario. We stood up here in a receiving line as people came to give their condolences as our son, at our son's funeral. So sometimes life doesn't always end up the way you want it to, and sometimes your dreams just seem to slip by. And that was our reality. And as Todd and I share a piece of our lives with you guys, we're praying that you don't see us, you don't see our issues, or you don't see us as people, but you see God, and that you know and see that God cares for each one of you guys as well. You know, there are no hopeless situations, but there's only people who have grown hopeless because of their situations. But our Heavenly Daddy took what seemed to be totally impossible, should have totally destroyed us, and turned it around and redeemed it. And he can do the same for you guys.
So I'm going to start out this morning with a word. It's called busted. Have you ever kept a secret? Have you ever kept a secret life or a secret that you didn't tell? I think we've all kept secrets at a time in our life. Secrets that might have started when we were young, and sometimes they would have been fine to keep a secret. But I was 38 years old, and there was a time in my life where that word busted became real. You know, I was 38 years old. I was much too old to be keeping secrets, especially from my wife. But God has a way of exposing our secrets. There's a verse in the Bible that says, "Be sure your sin will find you out." And I always thought that it was God wanted to rat me out, or, you know, it's not what it is. God is just stating the fact, I think, that sin growing inside of you isn't going to stay there. Eventually it'll ooze out and leak out. So I'm going to take you sort of on a journey of some of my secrets, and then how God was able to expose those secrets to bring healing and restoration. And then also on our journey, we're going to talk about the death of our son and how we were able to work through that extremely hard time. So thanks, everybody, for coming here and listening to us. And I hope, just like all these other stories, I hope our story also will give you hope in your own marriage, in your own life. Knowing, like Marie said, when you feel hopeless, to know that there is hope, that God is a redeeming God. So I was at this place. I had been busted. I'd been living a secret life for a long time. And many times in married life, you know, something will come up, and I would confess to that thing, to that secret, or I would make a mistake, and I would confess to that, but many times I wouldn't go to the root cause of what that was. I remember the situation clearly. Marie came up to my office. I have a home office. She came up to my office and she said, "Todd, I wanted to know what this is. This movie is on the phone." You see, she was challenging me. She found something. I had been struggling with a porn addiction for many years. It hadn't started out as a porn addiction. In fact, as I think back to when I was much younger, it was just a curious thing. I was around 12 years old when I was first exposed to pornography. I was 12 years old when a lot of things happened in my life. I was starting to become a young man, and there were challenges that I was going through. But I started at that point to keep a secret. I was exposed to pornography, and it brought some exhilaration. Now, I'd grown up in a Christian church, in a Christian home, went to church. I actually went to Christian school. And there's many things I knew about the Bible and what was right and what was wrong. I had two loving parents that cared a lot for me. And when I was 12, I could have told them, what I was exposed to, but I chose not to. And as I think back now, I'm thinking, Todd, why didn't you just tell somebody then instead of starting this secret life? But I wasn't sure if that was the right thing to do. When I take myself back to when I was 12, I was unsure. Another thing that I'd like to go on a journey is when I was 12, I also had started going to a new church. And I remember at that time, I really desired to have some friends. Being a boy, I like to play like cops and robbers, cowboys and Indians, and do these things with other boys. We started going to this new church and was trying to get some new friends. And for some reason, when I got there, all the other boys didn't want to sit with me, and they sort of excluded me from their life. And they would say, "There's something wrong with Todd." Well, I didn't know what it was, but I thought, I got to change because they don't like who I am. And so I started imitating them. I started acting like them. I started losing who I really was and how God had created me. And it was after a couple of weeks, one of the boys came up to me and said, "Todd, I want to be your friend, and I've been noticing you the last couple of weeks, and it seems like you're pretty cool. I'm not sure why some of these other boys don't want to be part of your life or be your friend. Why don't you come over to my house, and we'll develop a friendship, and then I'll introduce you to the other guys, and you'll have friends." Somehow that boy knew that I was struggling with wanting to have a friend. We were later that afternoon at his house. I had a strong desire to be included, to be accepted, and I was willing really to do what I needed to do to have a friend. And that boy took advantage of my desire to do that. But it was interesting, even though I knew that was wrong what he was doing, it still felt good to be accepted who I was. But I kept a secret. And for the next couple weeks and months, that boy included me with the other friends, But that was still a relationship that I had with him for a couple years. All the time knowing it was wrong, but at the same time, I liked to have that friendship. So I kept keeping that secret. Eventually, I started getting to high school and started to really having a desire to date girls. But my teacher at that point of what women were like and who they are was many times with porn or searching it out or my own lustful desires. I didn't have a value. I didn't understand the value of a woman. I didn't understand the treasure that they are. So I dated a few women in high school, and many times would just try to see how far I could go and that type of thing. But eventually, when I was 18, I met this beautiful woman. And I remember when I first saw her, I thought there's something different about her. And it wasn't just her looks, although it could have been just her looks because she was gorgeous.
I was considered a woman at 16.
Okay. She was a very attractive young lady. I thought she was older than what she was, but I was 18 at the time. But do you know what I saw in her? She had a relationship with Christ. She had an authenticity. She was one person. So at that point in my life, which person do you think I showed her? Did I show her my sinful self? Or did I show her the self that I'd built up that I wanted everybody to see? I wasn't stupid. I knew that if I showed her the real self, the real me, I didn't have a chance. So I started to be who I thought she wanted me to be. And we fell in love and we dated and we had some really good times, good relationships. And there were times where she would see a glimpse of me and be the real me. And we could experience, and we had a closeness because of that. I remember on our first date, I was like, I'm not going to even sit next to her because she is something special. Whereas, but as time went on, we started developing a relationship, and pretty soon I was back into my own selfish desires. But during that dating relationship, we started to get convicted of where I was sort of pushing things, and we actually rededicated our relationship to Christ. And we said, we're not going to have sex before we get married. And it was a noble thing. It was a righteous thing. But still, my sinful self was doing things that weren't right, that weren't pure. Many times I would get convicted or feel guilty, and I'd throw all my magazines away, everything I have, but I would never share my secrets. And so there was a time now that I'm going to jump forward to now when I'm 38 years old. And I remember as she was leaving my office and walking downstairs, I felt this voice in my head saying, Todd, you've been yearning to get set free from this addiction for so long. Now's the time to confess everything. Not just this one video that she found, but to confess everything. I didn't know how to do that. I didn't know how to confess everything. I didn't know if I even liked who I was. You know, that time in my life, I couldn't look at myself in the mirror. I couldn't look myself in the eyes because I didn't like what I saw. The sin has a way of creating shame. And there's a difference between guilt and shame. Guilt would say, I made a mistake. And shame says, I am a mistake. When I kept falling back into the same sin that I said I wouldn't do, I started to really feel shame. I lost value of who I was. My sinful self would say, you're not a good husband. You're not a good Christian. And so that's where I was. So then we started to go to counseling. And Marie and I were youth leaders at the time. We were here in this church, and we looked like we had it all together. And honestly, you know, I was making a lot of good choices. It wasn't like all my choices were bad. But I remember when we were driving to the counseling office, Marie goes, what are people going to think? Todd and Marie are going to counseling. And it was as I shared with that counselor for the first time about all the stuff that happened to me. And I didn't want to go back into my past and look at that. I wanted to move forward. I wanted to be set free and be healed. And so I looked at this place. But I had to state where I was at. Guys, if you ever want to go on a trip, like say to Paris, and you go on the internet or call a travel agent if they still have them, and you tell them you want to buy a ticket to Paris, what's the first question that they would ask you? Where are you coming from? Where do you want to start from? So many times I said, I want to be there, but I wasn't willing to state out loud where I was at. So I had to say where I was at. So Marie, do you want to go in and share a little bit?
I'm watching the clock up here. So Todd is now disclosing a secret lifestyle to me. And it was just one thing after another after another. And I felt like in Job when it says, like, I don't know it all by heart, but, you know, it was just one thing after another. They kept coming back, and the servants kept coming back and said, this is happening. And finally, your children are all dead. And it says he falls to his knees. But actually, just today, I realized it says he falls to his knees in worship. And I thought, wow, that's challenging. Talk about not being a victim. He falls to his knees in worship. I just fell to my knees, not in worship. I just fell to my knees. So behind every husband who suffers from a sexual addiction like mine did is a wife who is deeply affected and wounded by that sexual addiction. So that's what I was, the wounded wife. The moment Todd told me, like, all his lifestyle was the moment that my whole ground underneath me shattered. I know Janelle talked about grounds shattering. I could almost see my ground shattering, and I didn't know how to stop it from crumbling, and I didn't even know how to get healing. Like, it was just like, you just feel like you're falling in like a black hole. So life as I knew it the day before was totally different the next day. My security was completely gone. The security, the safety that I had in a marriage was completely gone. Like, I knew we had some marital problems, because don't we all? But I could not even comprehend what I was going to be hearing coming out of his mouth. My body went into, like, a state of trauma. I started to shake uncontrollably because the trauma was so bad. I felt abandoned, I felt alone, and I felt rejected. And it wasn't just that I felt that from my husband, but all of a sudden, I felt it from God too. And I thought, where is God in all this? You know, we were youth leaders. I was a strong Christian. What in the world is happening? I hated the pain. It seemed my life had become hopeless and undesirable. We had our 4 kids at the time. Most of my days during those time was spent in my room crying. I was very angry at Todd because I knew the more stress you have, the more you quickly you age. And I remember being so angry at him for a wrinkle I had on my face. I was like, how dare him? Yeah, so I just felt hopeless. I felt like life was undesirable. And I went back through some of my journals the other day, and the one thing I journaled the week of the disclosure, I said, today I laid on the hard tile bathroom floor in a fetal position and cried. The pain is so deep, and at times I feel I'll never reach the bottom of it. I couldn't understand what I did to deserve having the new title as a betrayed wife. But then, fast forward 4 weeks, 1 month after the disclosure, it was a day before our 19th wedding anniversary, and instead of all the giddy celebrations and happiness, we were driving into the city to have to an STD clinic. It was the most humiliating, darkest moments of my life. I sat there as a nurse showed me all the horrible diseases I could have. I felt low. I felt completely forsaken. And when the nurse left the room, I just cried out to God in hopeless despair. I said, God, where are you? I feel so deserted. And when I opened up my eyes, I was the only one in the room at the time. When I opened up my eyes focused right on this little picture on the nurse's desk that I had never seen before. Well, I had never seen it that day. And it was a picture of Jesus. And when I opened my eyes, that picture that painted Jesus, his eyes met my eyes. And his hands were like this. It was one of those pictures. He's just like, it's a very common picture. His hands were pointed directly in my direction. And I felt like he just connected with my heart. And Christ said, I am here with you. And I just realized it was one of the darkest days of my life. And I knew that if God was with me there, that he wasn't going to leave me on this journey. Psalms 139:8 says, if I go to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depth, you are there. So it didn't matter where I was going, God was always going to be there. So this treacherous, I call it treacherous because it's a hard journey. This treacherous journey began of facing some of the deepest wounds that were now placed on me. But I wasn't doing it alone. I was doing it with God by my side.
So I had to see my wife hurt. The husband that was supposed to protect her, to care for her. You know, in 1993, I made a vow before my family and friends, a covenant with her and with God, that I was going to treasure her and always love her. I didn't fulfill those vows. I always said I had control of my sin, that it wasn't having control of me. But eventually I broke those vows. So how did I get healing? I saw my wife devastated, crying, hurt. I wanted to help her. But through counseling, I started to understand before I can help my wife heal, I needed to find healing for myself. You know, if you're on an airline and the oxygen gets out of the cabin and the masks drop down, what do they tell you to do? Before you help anybody, put it on yourself. That's what I needed to do. I needed to find healing. And ultimately, that was the best thing I could do for my wife at that point, is to find healing for myself. And you know, it's really noble, guys, to stuff our feelings and our thoughts. Like when our son first got sick, our son Seth first got sick, I stuffed a lot of my feelings that he had. Seth had a brain tumor when he was 11 and went through chemo and radiation and surgery. And a year and a half later, he had been declared cancer-free. But I stuffed a lot of those hurts and fear that I had. And that's why I ended up breaking my marriage vows. So I had to go back. I had to start taking some of those shame lies I believed about myself. The shame lie that says I am a mistake. And I had to put truth to that lie. The truth says in the Bible that God created us for a purpose and a plan, that we are not a mistake. We're not judged by the things we've done, but we're judged by who created us. And I knew that God had created me to be a purpose. So when that shame lie came and said, you are a mistake, I could say back, yes, I made a mistake, but there's somebody who died for my sins to take that pain away. If God expected us to be perfect and not make any mistakes, he wouldn't have sent Jesus to this earth. He knew we couldn't be perfect. And that's why Jesus had to come and die for us. So I think the number one fuel of sexual addiction for guys is that shame that keeps coming back. It's not what starts the addiction, but that's what feeds it. So I had to write down what shame says. And there was a lot of shame lies that I believed. And I had to write a lot of them down. I'd also told myself that if I didn't talk about this, if I kept it, and if I didn't share it with anybody, that it wasn't a problem. If you think about a job at work, and if you have a problem and you don't talk about it, that would be foolish. But I had this problem. And so for so many years, I thought if I don't talk about it, it's going to go away. Problems don't just go away. You have to address them. I'd also believed that keeping it a secret, it wasn't a problem. But just like a sickness when it grows inside of you, whether you know it or not, if there's a sickness growing inside of you, it's going to grow, even if you keep it a secret. You have to address that. So I needed to accept where I was at. I started to confess weekly to an accountability person of where I was at, the things I chose to do. I had to be honest. I had to get help. There's a lot of good books and a lot of teaching. Christ is the one that ultimately does the healing. But guys, we have to allow what other people have gone through and pointing us to Christ to allow them to speak into our lives. So many times people say, I'd hate to be growing up in a kid in today's society with all the easy access to porn and all these things. Yes, I'd hate that too. But at the same time, there's so much more hope and healing now than there was before. So play those stories. Listen to them. Guys, I always wanted to be a man of integrity. And finally, when I could start confessing my sin and taking responsibility for the choices I made, I started to be that man. I started to feel that man. When I could go before the eldership board at our church and saying, these are the choices I did, and I'm willing to accept the consequences, I left that feeling like a man of integrity I always wanted to be.
Yeah, so Todd was doing the right things and taking responsibilities for his actions. As he said, he sat before the elders and talked to them, and he talked to mentors and stuff. But the more I heard the words, the more it became a reality to me. And it was like this thing that I just wanted to wake up from a nightmare, but I started to realize that this was actually my life. This was really happening. There was no waking up from this nightmare. So yes, I did not choose to be hurt. How many of us choose to be hurt? Not many of us choose to be hurt. So it wasn't my choice. But we've been talking about victims and stuff. But we all have the choice on how we're going to respond to the hurt. So I never chose to be hurt, but I do have a choice on how I respond to the hurt. When our son Seth was diagnosed at the age of 11 with brain cancer, I remember we were having this discussion, him and I said, Seth, it's not a question of cancer is going to change you. It's going to change you, but it's your choice on how it's going to change you. Will it change you for the better or for the worse? And God has been bringing that conversation back over and over in my mind, but God's now asking me. It's not a question if this is going to change you, but how is it going to change you, Marie? Is it going to make you run towards God, or is it going to make you run towards hatred? Let's see. So, Todd was not the only one who had to work on things in the relationship. Yes, I did not go and, I didn't have an affair or anything like that, but I had a lot of things to work on with me too, and how I treated him, or the kind of wife I was, or just there's always stuff to work on. It wasn't like he was the only one working here. We were both needing to work on a marriage. So I am going to drop the F word right here. Forgiveness. I know. It's one of those hush-hush words. No. Forgiveness became my door to freedom. But the question was, how do I open that door? Here I have this man who totally hurt me. How do I even open that door of forgiveness? I had to learn what forgiveness really was. The true meaning of forgiveness, I don't know if you'll find this on Webster, but this is Marie's true meaning of forgiveness. So it's official. The true meaning of forgiveness is releasing the other person who hurt you, from the debt that they owe you. It's understanding that what God did on the cross was enough to cover their debt. Melissa Hawes explains this very well in a short account. Do I have time to read it? Okay. I'm going to read this, and I just want you to imagine this. Now, this is going to be talking about with a spouse who hurt the other spouse, but it can work in any situation of your life. So I'm going to read this. It's a couple paragraphs. Imagine that you and your spouse are standing in a courtroom. God is sitting in the judge's seat, and Jesus is standing in between you and your spouse. The charges have been read, and God asks your spouse one question: how will you repay this debt? And your spouse, looking into the eyes of God, shamefully but honestly answers in a small voice, I can't. Then God looked at you and asked one question: well, what will you have me do with your mate? And you think about what you would want God to do. Very well, God says, and he motions to the officials in the courtroom, and they walk towards you and your spouse. But instead of taking your spouse away, they take the arm of Jesus. What are you doing? You ask. And your spouse looks just as astonished. And God answers, before this trial, your advocate, Jesus, came to me and told me he wanted to pay the debt for your spouse. And I agreed that whatever you asked me to do to your spouse, he would have done to him. Your heart is filled with a wave of grief and anger you have never known before, and you begin to protest. Of course, that's not fair, is it? Then God, with tears running down his face, looks at the both of you and your spouse and says, you are both free. For your advocate, my son, Jesus Christ, has paid the debt for your sin and the cost of forgiveness. Go and live in peace. And stunned, you just both leave the courtroom. And Melissa Hawes continues on by saying, if you want to be whole in your life, there must come a time when you release your spouse from the debt that they owe you and allow what Jesus Christ did on the cross to be enough. So I needed to forgive so that I was not kept in bondage in that hatred. That was my freedom. I also needed to know what my true identity was, because things just seemed to be slipping out of my hand. Like all these things I had secure, they were just slipping from me. And I had to know what was my true identity. You see, emotional wounds can become our identity if we allow them to. See, I saw myself at that time as a betrayed wife. I was wounded, I was unloved, I was not valued. That was what I was taking on as my new identity. And I even wrote in my journal 5 years ago, when I look in the mirror, who do I see? I see a tired, weary, aging woman who hates the pain that entered her world. I see a woman who feels alone and unloved, even by God. I see hopelessness. I see a woman who is not good enough for her husband. That is what I see as I look at the reflection. But my heart yearns to hear what God sees. Yet it is so hard when the voices from my wounds are screaming at me from the reflection I see in the mirror. So this is my distorted view of who I had become. But praise God, that's not who he says we are. In Jeremiah 31:3, he says, I have loved you with an everlasting love, and I have drawn you with loving kindness. So my new identity was not, I'm not taking on the wounds. My new identity I decided to take on was that I am loved. I am loved, I am loved, I am valued, and I am worth something to Christ. And that was the identity I took on, and that was key to my healing, was to learn how to forgive and to take on the identity of being loved.
Right. And as I was working on myself, I started to find healing and started having a lot of success. But many times in a marriage relationship, Marie had to forgive like she talked about. But forgiveness and trust are two different things. She was willing and able to forgive. That was something she could do totally independent of me. Didn't depend anything on me. She was able to come to that place of forgiveness. Trust, on the other hand, as a marriage, was my responsibility. I had to become a trustworthy person. And how could I do that after all those years of being untrustworthy? After breaking those vows, I had to start being trustworthy in small things, not big things. I had to allow her to question me. And I had to be humble. And I had to be trustworthy. I also needed to allow Marie to be in a state of fear. She would sometimes have triggers. If I would go to a meeting, she would sometimes have that same fear because she didn't know where I was. She couldn't trust. And I couldn't force her to trust me. It wouldn't have been healthy. It wouldn't have even been possible. But how could I make it safe for her? So I had came up with a plan of how to make certain things safe. And it was my responsibility to take those things and saying, here, this is how you know where I was at. This is how you know. You know, I'm 38, 39 years old now working on this, but I still had to keep doing this to build up that trust again. So guys, I challenge you to be willing to be humble and allow your wife to heal. It was okay when she had triggers. It was interesting, you showed that nail thing of listening. I had to do a lot of listening. One thing I learned in counseling, that as she's sharing, Marie's a processor. And so she'll process a verbal processor. Yeah, sorry. So when she's telling me how she feels, that's how she feels. It's not necessarily the facts. So when she would say, I hate you for what you did, that's not really what she felt. She was processing that. It was okay for her to be angry. The Bible says don't sin in her anger, but we get angry. And she had every right to be angry at me. And I needed to allow her to process and work through that. And I had to remember and remind myself, she's sharing her feelings. She's sharing her hurts. She's not sharing the facts. And that helped me a lot in my healing. I also need to show her love again. Love was very distorted to her because I would have told her I loved her during this whole time. But a person who loves her wouldn't have betrayed her. So I had to learn to show her love in new ways, in ways that were real and honest. Many times when we're working on our marriage, it's not the only thing we're working on. There's different chaos, there's different things that happens. So as we're working through this in our marriage, our son got really sick again. And I remember being on the hospital. He was actually lifeline down to Johns Hopkins Hospital in Baltimore. Lifeline means helicopter flown in, and I went along, and Marie drove down. I remember laying on the hospital floor just crying as Seth lay sleeping on the bed, saying, God, I'm doing all the right things. Finally being a man of integrity, finally making the right choices. I'm being a good husband, I'm being a good Christian, I'm being a good father, and now my life's falling apart. And I remember laying there just crying out to God, telling him how I feel. And he sort of shared with me, Todd, this is different than the last time, isn't it? The last time you ran from your pain. Now you're addressing it. The pain was just as great. But where is that pain going to be heading? When pain comes, guys, I encourage you to take the necessary steps for healing. So I could share with God that night. I read some of the Psalms of how David lamented through some of his pain. I started writing that down, journaling how much pain I felt and how much hurt I felt. Go ahead.
We could talk all day, but we know you guys want to keep moving now. So I was seeing Todd. Embracing our son and not running from that pain. I'm just going to fast forward a little bit because we're getting low on time. So it was October 9th. It was the evening before our son passed away. Todd and I knelt, this is a miracle, as a unified couple, releasing our son completely to God. I have never released a child in that way, that capacity, but we completely, with our hands held open, said, God, we are completely giving Seth to you. If you are not going to heal him on this earth, we pray that you take him quickly. And it was the next day that we did one of the hardest and the most beautiful things as we walked our son to the hands of Christ on October 9th. Many times we question God's reasoning. Why? But we have found a peace knowing that God is still sovereign and he is still always in control.
We're talking today about God's love being redemptive. When I look back over my healing journey and how God sort of allowed my sin to be exposed and took some steps, I realize how much God loves me. God cared for me enough where I was still living in his sin that he wanted me to find healing before Seth died. So 5 months before Seth, or 6 months before Seth died, I was able to find that healing. I could be one person. Guys, when you're living a double life and you can't feel love, you can't experience love because they don't know everything about you. When I look back now, God cared enough for me while I was still living in that sin that he allowed me to find a place of forgiveness. That those 5 months I spent with Seth were some of the most treasured months I had with him. The other way God was so redemptive is I always had this tremendous fear of death. Almost overwhelming sense of fear of death. When I could be there with my son and hold his hand and see him go from this life to the next. Feelings came up inside of me that I never knew. The wailing and everything, we just wailed. It was so sad. The same way I felt an inner peace. I felt an inner peace just like life, and I saw my children being born, and now I saw my son dying. I knew that it wasn't the end. You know, God's a redemptive God, and I no longer have that fear of death in my life, and God has allowed me to be healed in that area as well.
Yes. So, in Jeremiah 30:18 says, "The city will be rebuilt upon her ruins. For so long I wanted my cracked and my broken heart to be perfect again. I wanted it to be completely whatever you want to call normal. I wanted it to be beautiful again. But what I have learned is that it's those broken pieces that had led me to an intimacy with Christ that I would have never had without them. Each scar that is on my heart reminds me of the love that God showed me through some of those darkest times." I brought this along, and to you it probably looks like a broken plate, but it's not. And I'm not exactly sure how to say this word, but it changed. You know, you kind of have those moments where oh wow, those epiphany moments. This is called, here we go, kintsukuroi. It is the Japanese art of repairing with gold. I'm going to hold my item. I'm just going to read this really quick. The saying goes that a young servant was taking a clay cup to a high-ranking military leader. On the boy's way, the pottery slipped from his hands and shattered on the ground. Instead of the fierce anger of the leader overtaking the servant, the military officer, in turn, had his favorite cup repaired with gold. Because of how it was repaired, the piece of the pottery became more valuable than if it had never been damaged. It goes on to say the life of this pottery only began the moment it was dropped. And it's God's repairing us with this gold that makes us more, maybe not more beautiful, but it brings value that I always wanted to be completely better, but God has taught me how to embrace it because it's embracing my journey, it's embracing some of my brokenness, it's embracing my story that makes me whole. So God can take a hopeless situation and make it more beautiful than before.